Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on environmental considerations for drone pilots, featuring Oceans Unmanned's Eco-Drone program. Before we begin, I wanted to mention that we will have a Q&A session at the end. So if anyone thinks of any questions during the webinar, please feel free to submit them in the chat section on your screen. We will get to any questions at the end. Also, please be sure to just mute yourself during the webinar just to eliminate any background noise. So today's speakers are Matt and Brian. Matt is the president of Oceans Unmanned. He spent 20 years providing operational support for NOAA aboard ships, small boats, aircraft, and diving. He has 12 years experience supporting the NOAA Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. His aviation experience includes remote sensing and living marine resource surveys and small UAS missions supporting environmental research and monitoring requirements. Brian is the director of Oceans Unmanned. He spent 26 years in operational and leadership positions within the federal government. As commanding officer of NOAA's Aircraft Operations Center, he was responsible for the overall management of NOAA's aircraft support services. He managed the NOAA flight program and established the procedures and standards which govern the program. He has experience in all NOAA operations, such as ship, aircraft, dive, and unmanned aerial vehicles, with over 6,000 accident-free flight hours. So we're very excited to have Matt and Brian speak on this topic today, and I will now pass it over to them, and they will start covering the Eco-Drone program.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you everybody online for taking the time to tune in. Brian, you want to say hello?
Hi, everybody. This is Brian.
So first of all, we'll talk a little bit about how Eco-Drone started. Oceans Unmanned, the parent organization, is a nonprofit that Brian and I formed about 3 years ago to help agencies kind of adopt unmanned technologies for environmental research and monitoring programs. While we were working with these different agencies, the Bureau of Land Management kept coming to us with this issue of recreational drone disturbance along the Central California coast. Some critical seabird nesting habitats are along the coast, and recreational drone users were flying and flushing those birds off the nest, which was causing some concerns among the scientists and researchers. So they asked us if we could help develop education and outreach program, because they're the federal government and a nonprofit can react quicker and ramp up a program quicker than the federal government. So that they turned to us, and we started the Eco-Drone program, basically developing some education and outreach materials that BLM could pass out at trailheads along Central California. And it kind of expanded from there to be kind of a nationwide education outreach program. At the time, we struggled a little bit with trying to get specifics for each kind of species and platform, and what the best scientific methods were or recommendations were for flights and altitudes. The problem was that each species kind of reacts differently to each drone. A fixed wing makes a different noise profile than a Phantom 4, or a Phantom 4 makes a different profile, noise profile, both visually and acoustically, and each species reacts different to that. So as we struggled to try to find some best practices that could be easily, translatable to the general public, we realized that that's kind of a long way away. And so we launched Eco-Drone kind of as a general awareness campaign that there are environmental laws that apply to drone operations, that disturbance is an issue that matters to species, and both endangered species and threatened species, and trying to get the message out there to be responsible, be aware of these environmental laws. So that's kind of the purpose of the Eco-Drone. So why does disturbance matter? You're flying along and you see some birds flush, and it's like, well, birds fly and they'll return to that nest. It's not that big of a deal. But when these birds, for example, this is just one species, flush, the eggs can get knocked off the rocky roost. They're exposed to predators, and those predators can come in when those birds are gone, or the eggs get knocked into the ocean or destroyed. That one flushing event can damage that breeding season of that colony for an entire year. So even though it's a very brief flushing event for birds, you can damage a colony's breeding success for that whole season. And so every single disturbance matters. And when you talk about disturbance from drones, from kayaks, or from people walking along the beach, those cumulative effects can really affect the wildlife. Two, we wanted to kind of ensure that drone operators could get the information to keep them out of trouble, because these environmental laws like the Endangered Species Act, we'll talk about, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, they apply to drone operators. And somebody who's just starting to get into the drone world, whether they're recreational or commercial operators, may not be aware that they are liable for environmental damage that they may do either consciously or unconsciously. And so it was a two-pronged: one, to protect the wildlife, but also two, to protect the drone operators and have them understand that they are responsible for following environmental rules. So we're going to show a quick short film here to kind of illustrate some of the regulations that apply, and also kind of a bit of the uncertainty. You'll see in this film, we didn't necessarily answer the questions about specific laws because there's some interpretation there, and we'll get into details a little bit more. I think this is like an 8 or 9 minute film if you want to start that, Alicia.
Drones have been a real game changer for our work with marine mammals. With them only spending 10% of their time at the surface, we only have a brief second to study them. And with drones, it allows us a non-intrusive way to get very close and really look at the whales.
It's always a lot of fun because you're close to animals. You know, it's beautiful, it's challenging, and also you're seeing animals from a perspective that you normally don't get to see them. So all of a sudden you're seeing things that you hadn't seen before.
On the research side, there's a lot of resistance at first, but when they see the UAS in action, see the imagery and the data we can collect, and see the low disturbance for the species, they get a lot more comfortable with what you're doing. All of us who use UAS for research or private use, it's us to be responsible and show people that they are low disturbance, that they're not spying on people in their backyard. They're just kind of a tool like a video camera was 20 years ago.
I've flown over 1,300 flights and we haven't had a single issue. They've been really reliable. By getting a vertical perspective above whales, we can look at their shape profiles and really tell what kind of condition they're in.
We're finding that we're doing projects that we couldn't do in the past, or at least we couldn't do them efficiently with manned aircraft. With a manned aircraft, it would cost us $100,000 to collect samples on maybe a dozen animals. Now, with the unmanned aircraft, we get better data on 70 or 80 animals, and it costs us about $5,000. So it's a dramatic savings. I think that we're just at the start of the boom for use of UAS in the sciences.
For whale watching companies, it's new technology that fits in super well, non-invasive to the animals, awe-inspiring to the passengers.
Now that we put the drone up in the air, I think people are just now seeing how big these whales actually are, especially when they come next to a boat and we now have gotten that perspective.
Otherwise, it might just be a little spout we're seeing in the distance, might just see a little bat coming out of the water. But when we're able to live stream that drone footage to our passengers and say, hey, this is the whale we're watching, it becomes a lot more engaging, a lot more exciting for their experience.
Every single month, a new whale watch company has a drone on their boat.
For the last year, we've probably flown drones over whales at least once a week, variety of species, virtually all the cetacean species that are found in Southern California. What we've seen is virtually no measurable reaction to any of these animals that a drone is hovering over them.
I do not fly over any sea lions, seals, otters, any of the marine mammals that go on land, because they're more aware of things that are going on above water.
The term UAS was developed to describe these unmanned aerial systems. One of the reasons they called them unmanned aerial systems was so they wouldn't have to call them aircraft. Because if you call them aircraft, then they fall under the umbrella of the FAA and a bazillion regulations. That trick didn't work. The FAA is responsible for these and managing them. So it means that getting the opportunity to fly these things requires a lot of paperwork. By the time we go into the field to fly a mission, we've generated paperwork that weighs more than the aircraft. A recreational user doesn't have to jump through the hoops that we have to jump through. Their pilots don't need to be certified. It's kind of a free fire zone for them.
It's challenging for the permitting agencies, though, because their regulatory policies are just catching up with this technology and can't quite keep up.
The primary protection for marine mammals in the United States is the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which was passed in the early 1970s. It's one of the strongest environmental laws that we have.
It's a really interesting situation. By FAA rules, we have to be below 400 feet, but by the MMPA, we have to be above 1,000 feet. What we do is all under permit. If you weren't under permit, it would pretty much be impossible.
You know, I will stress that they're classified as aircraft, so you need a permit, whether you're a researcher or not, to fly under 1,000 feet over whales.
Taking a marine mammal is a term that comes from the Marine Mammal Protection Act. A take that constitutes harassment is essentially causing a marine mammal to change whatever its natural behavior is. So if you come upon a marine mammal and it's sleeping and you cause it to take an alert posture and maybe move away from you, that's a violation of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. That's disturbance. That's take.
National Marine Fisheries Service has decided that the presence of the drone near the animal is a take. People who are not under a research permit, if they use a drone in the proximity of a marine mammal, for instance, let's say a whale watching company, they're probably violating terms of the MMPA.
When we're talking about regulations and drones, my hope would be that we use science to determine impact, if any, and we also just use common sense to realize that, yeah, these machines we're flying above the animals are in no way comparable to helicopters or aircraft. Their profile is so small, both visually and from a sound element.
Most users are very responsible in the way they do business, but some aren't.
All it takes is a few bad apples, and people out there who are irresponsible can upset the reputation of reputable UAS operators and researchers.
In, I'd say, the last 5 years, we've seen a decided uptick in the amount of marine mammal and seabird disturbance by the public. And some of the reasons we think that might be is a lot of increased wildlife programming on television, high definition, close-up shots of wildlife. When people go back out to the beach the next time or get on the ocean, they're like, I want a shot like that for my Facebook page. So you have social media coming into play here too, where people want to report every instant of their miraculous vacation within seconds of seeing it to all their friends and family.
Now that we have social media and drones, we're seeing such a different perspective, and we're seeing more of everything. I got a comment the other day from someone that said, like, you're seeing killer whales eating a gray whale, should we not go to the beach anymore? And it's like these whales have always been doing this, but people aren't seeing it until now because of the drone perspective.
I don't want to discourage the public because it can engage a whole new generation of kids who are really into the tech and inspire them to get into wildlife photography. But on the other hand, it exposes these remote places that people couldn't get to before.
We're always trying to strike that balance. We want people to appreciate and enjoy the sanctuary, but we also don't want them to hurt it or even inadvertently love it to death, because that can happen too. Now the animals are being chased, they can't feed, they can't rest. If you keep getting interrupted, every time you try to go to sleep, after a while you get drugged down, you get tired, and then you get sick. And that's what happens to these animals. When a person goes in and encroaches on a sea otter or a seal or a sea lion, they think, well, it was just a few seconds. But what they don't see is the line of people behind them, that a few seconds here, a few seconds here, a few seconds there. And what they don't see is that animal getting sick and then possibly even dying 6 months later. But it's what we call the death by 1,000 cuts.
So I think it's going to be education and outreach, and respect the wildlife and respect to the people that you're flying near or around. If you're flying, somewhere and people are enjoying the wildlife, you don't want to disturb the wildlife, but you also don't want to disturb the other people who may be enjoying the wildlife. Start high, look for disturbance, make sure you follow the FAA regulations, the NOAA regulations, the Park Service regulations. Those are constantly changing, so it'll take some effort to continue to stay educated if you want to be a responsible UAS operator.
Everyone enjoys seeing wild animals do what wild animals do. I do. And I like seeing them doing what they would normally do as if I weren't there. It's important to me that they be allowed that latitude, because human beings can have a massive impact on the environment around them. And it can be a very negative impact if it's not done responsibly. I want them to be a dolphin and a whale. I want them to be operating in the wild as they have for eons without that being changed or shifted by human actions. And I think there's a way that we can do that. We need to stay out of their way so that it can continue to thrive and develop the way nature meant for it to do.
Apologies for the kind of jerkiness of that film. At least it was kind of jerky on my laptop. If you want to see a smoother version, you can go to the EcoDrone website and find a link there. There are a few details in there that are kind of conflicting and not quite clear. And if you want to hold your questions till the end of the webinar, I'll try to provide some clarity on some of the points raised in that short film. So as I mentioned, we couldn't wait for kind of specific guidelines for each species and each platform and the reactions and the best practices. And so while you're waiting for that kind of scientific consensus to try to rally around some specific guidelines, we launched EcoDrone kind of as a general awareness campaign, just to try to, as I said, educate the recreational drone users that there are environmental concerns and laws that apply. And so we boiled those down to kind of 4 basic tips, which we'll go through here in the next few slides. One is know before you go, keep your distance, respect all wildlife, and then spread the word. Next slide, please. So there's above and beyond the FAA regulations, and FAA is the sole authority for airspace management. There are other regulated areas and laws that affect drone operation and manned aircraft operations for that matter. And the 4 areas you should be aware of here, and I'll talk about each individual, is the U.S. National Parks, NOAA National Marine Sanctuaries, federal designated wilderness areas, and then state parks. Next slide, please. So I think everybody's probably familiar with the National Park Service policy prohibits the launching, landing, and operation of unmanned aircraft within park boundaries. Again, that's not an airspace regulation. It just prohibits you from operating a drone while you're standing on National Park Service property. One of the easiest ways to kind of figure out if you're, in the boundaries of a park, if you're not obviously going through the front entrance and you're in the wilderness, it is those boundaries are displayed on the Air Map application. You can just have that app on your phone, pull up, it'll know your location, it'll show you the boundaries of the parks. It'll actually show you the regulatory language and the name of that park. So there's really no excuse for not knowing if you're in a park boundary if you take the time to do your due diligence, fire up your Air Map app, and then figure out where you are. So NOAA National Marine Sanctuaries might not be as familiar to everybody. Basically, they're the federal government's marine version of national parks. There's 13 or 14 national marine sanctuaries around the country. A few of those have regulated overflight zone that prohibits overflights below 1,000 feet. They're usually along the coast in western the U.S. and California, Oregon, or off the islands offshore of California, where there's high concentrations of wildlife, and particularly nesting seabirds. Again, these zones, we've gotten AirMap to display these zones, these overflight zones, on the AirMap app, and you can access those through the app to figure out where you are. Be advised that the entire sanctuary boundaries are not shown on the map, only the prohibited overflight zones, but you should also be aware, and we're still working with AirMap to try to get the entire sanctuary boundaries posted on their app. But the sanctuary boundaries, while they don't specifically prohibit overflights within those zones, they are high concentrations of wildlife in those sanctuaries, and the other environmental laws we'll be discussing, Marine Mammal Protection Act, Endangered Species Act, prohibit the disturbance of those within sanctuaries, and so you're more likely to violate other environmental laws with your flying within those sanctuaries with high concentrations of marine wildlife. In federally designated wilderness areas, they prohibit the operation of motorized equipment or landing of aircraft. So we're in discussions right now with AirMap to include those. We're getting all the GIS data layers so that AirMap can include those into their app, and so you can be aware. In the meantime, if you go to wilderness.net, you can pull the location of those designated wilderness areas where, again, it's not an airspace regulation. You're just not allowed to operate motorized equipment in those areas. And that's a challenging one because there is a lot of federally designated wilderness areas that are not as well known as parks or sanctuaries, and so it'll take a little bit of effort to figure out where you are if you're flying in the wilderness and make sure you know what you're doing there. Next slide. So state parks, we really don't have good intel on state parks because it varies from state to state, and it actually varies from park to park. So you're going to have to kind of, whatever state park you happen to be going to, either talk with the ranger as you're going in or do some research online to figure out if they prohibit or restrict the operation of drone within those state parks. So keep your distance. Fly as high as FAA regulations conditions permit. Obviously, you want to try to be at 400 feet or below for FAA regulations. Obviously, weather is going to dictate your ceiling there. But for the conditions, try to fly as high as possible. There's no reason to be low, and safer for people, safer for the equipment, and safer for the wildlife if you fly as high as possible. If you encounter wildlife or observe disturbance, depart the area as soon as possible. Basically, if an animal is in your area and turns its head to look at the drone, then you are on the cusp of a disturbance right there. And so if wildlife notices you, my recommendation would be depart the area as soon as possible to preserve the sanctity of that wildlife and protect yourself from potential violation of environmental laws. And minimize exposure time when you're flying your wildlife. If you're coming back from a flight and you see some wildlife, just try to move over them as quickly as possible back to the landing zone and land as soon as practicable. Again, recognize that drones may, disturb these wildlife. There was a study, some of you might have heard about black bears, where they collared a black bear and flew a drone over it. And while there was no visible signs of disturbance, the heart rate was spiking, the blood pressure was spiking, the stress hormones were spiking. So even if there's not, a visible sign of disturbance, you can be disturbing this wildlife, stress them out, and cause abandonment of nests or habitats and really affect that individual animal and possibly that species as well. And it's not even if the animal sees the drone too, that as I mentioned, that the sound of the drone, I was flying at a ranch last year, and just the buzz of the DJI Phantom that I was flying was a couple hundred yards from the stables, and the horses just started freaking out. So I terminated the flight, and there's no way that the horses could have saw the drone, but they heard that and sound like a bunch of hornets or bees and started stressing them out immediately. So again, it's not just visually, it's that sound that can as well. So respect all wildlife. So we're going to go through a few environmental rules and policies here that apply to your drone operations that you should be familiar with. Again, you can check the EcoDrone website, which provides links to these various environmental laws and policies if you want more details. The Endangered Species Act, probably everybody's heard of that. That protects endangered or threatened species and their habitats. Again, that disturbance can be applied under the Endangered Species Act. If you're flying near endangered species, you have to be super concerned about that regulation, understand the policies under that act. The Marine protects all marine mammals from take, and as you heard in that film, the definition of take is a challenging one for the general public to understand. When I first started working with NOAA, and the definition of take, where an animal, whether it was a polar bear when we were flying manned aircraft survey in the Arctic, would look at the airplane, the scientists had to record that as a take. And to me, I always thought, well, take meant you actually killed the animal, but the take under the Marine Mammal Protection Act is a completely different definition. It's about changing their behavior, and it's as simple as that, and you can be cited as taking that animal under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. A really tough definition to swallow and understand, but something that we all should be aware of. A few other ones: Airborne Hunting Act prohibits harassing of any bird or animal from aircraft. That was basically enacted to keep hunters from hunting from aircraft and finding herds of elk in the West, but that under the definition applies to drone operations too. Migratory Bird Treaty Act basically protects migratory birds from take, again, which includes to pursue. So if you're flushing migratory birds, you can be in violation of the MBTA as well. National Marine Sanctuaries Act, I mentioned that for the NOAA Marine Sanctuaries. There, in addition to the overflight zone that they have, the Act prohibits activities that injure sanctuary resources, and that could be flushing a bird if that causes injury to the nest or the egg, or any kind of marine mammals flushing from the beach. You could be in violation of the National Marine Sanctuaries Act. National Park Service policy, we've discussed that, and their prohibition from operating unmanned aircraft on their land. And this is just to remind these laws are kind of environmental laws as they apply to drones are always kind of being updated as they include drones or refine the language. So to keep track, we're trying to keep up-to-date information on our website, ecodrone.org, with the latest and greatest up there, and try and position that site as a portal for all information. So as a place to at least start your homework, if you're flying in wilderness areas or environmentally sensitive areas, check out our website. Next slide, please. And finally, the fourth kind of tip is to spread the word. Lead by example, fly respectfully. I mean, it's important not only to protect the wildlife, but to protect the reputation. We want to create, a community of responsible users in the drone community, so that, the public backlash doesn't cause, unnecessary regulations or policies that prohibit us from doing what we love to do and what we want to do, and enjoying, the wildlife and flying drones and taking photography and being out there. And so the more proactive we can be by encouraging each other to fly responsibly, the better. Again, follow our guidelines. We have education outreach materials. Please contact us so we can provide you with postcards or education outreach materials. Utilize social media to inspire and spread the word. I've done a couple talks on EcoDrone and gone to YouTube and pulled up a lot of videos of drones harassing wildlife, and I've noticed over the past couple of years that's kind of been trending down, and there's a lot of kind of backlash if you pose those harassment videos now. And so that public pressure of social media, I think, can help drive change and encourage environmentally conscious operations. And so I encourage everybody to stay focused on that and encourage the community to be environmental responsibility. And finally, again, just if you track us, if you need a starting point to understand environmental regulations, the scientific research, we try to update the website with the latest scientific papers on specific species and how they respond to drones. And again, this is kind of a portal as a starting point for you to kind of get some basic information and dig deeper if you're interested. And I think that might be the last slide.
Yeah, thank you
yes,
so much.
It is.
So we did get one question for the Q&A session. So Matt or Brian, I'm not sure if you could answer this, but someone asked, What type of birds in North America have been known to attack drones, if any?
I don't know specifically. I mean, I've heard rumors of eagles attacking drones. I've never experienced it. I've had kind of birds try to soar with the fixed wing sense fly EBs that we fly, but I've never seen one actually attack one. I have, like I said, heard rumors of eagles, kind of being aggressive towards them, but I have not experienced or seen factual basis for that rumor.
Okay, great. Well, that was the only question that we did receive. So we'll just wrap things up for today. If anyone does think of any other questions, please feel free to call us or contact Brian or Matt, and we'd be happy to help you out. I will also be sending out an email with a recording of today's webinar as well as a copy of the slide deck. So I'll also include contact information if any questions do come up. But besides that, thank you so much to Matt and Brian for joining us. And thanks, everyone. And we hope to see you guys in the future.